I just sat down for a great interview with legendary script consultant Linda Seger. Uh, she was a script consultant before that was even a job title. So she has a lot of great stories to tell, a very kind and wonderful person, lots of great insight to share. This was a recorded interview and not live, so we didn't do a live Q&A. But if you were watching this and wishing I asked a different question, or you want to hear from Linda on a topic that we didn't get into, leave that in the comments. We might do a follow-up video where we actually answer all of your questions. And by the way, Unpacking is available on Amazon in Kindle or paperback, and the Kindle is just 99 cents. She wanted this to be a very accessible book, and I do strongly recommend it. It was a very fun read. It's a big book with a lot of great stories, but it's a fast read too because it's a very enjoyable read. So check that out, and please enjoy my conversation with Linda Seger. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm very excited for this interview. I've been looking forward to it for weeks now. We will be talking with a legendary script consultant, Miss Linda Seger. Thank you for spending some time with us today.
Oh, sure. Love to.
And so we will be talking about a lot of things, a wide breadth, because we are going to be looking back at a full career of life as a storyteller and a consultant, and a life that kind of revolves around telling good stories. But then also the fact that you wrote your memoir recently, which is out now. It's available. You can find it, I'm sure, all over the place, but definitely on Amazon as well. And also just, I want to really, maybe we can even start out with just the journey of writing that. What was it like to write your own memoir?
Yes. Well, several friends had asked me, when are you going to write my memoir? Your memoir. And I said, am I supposed to write a memoir? And they said, but your stories are so good and your life was so interesting and you've been to so many places. I've been to 33 countries to teach. And so I thought about it for about 2 years. And I thought, I don't want to just do, she was born in, and then. So I decided to do it thematically. And I thought of key events. And I also thought of influencers in my life. You'll probably notice, I think it's in the second chapter, but maybe the first chapter, that my mother said to me, she heard this sermon once where the minister asked the question, how many people did it take to make you who you are? And I started to think of people who were very impactful. And I thought I wouldn't be me without that friend or that other consultant or that colleague or, any number of people. So part of what I wanted to do was to talk about those people who had influence on my life. And then I've had, as you notice when you read it, some adventures. One is being stuck on a mountain with no place to get off of it except to fall. And I had to figure out how to get off the mountain. I thought that was an adventure. My husband said, I really hate it when you tell me about that and talk about it, because he wasn't there, but it was very scary and I had to have my wits about me. And another was saving somebody's life, where I thought, boy, I was a wreck. She was probably a wreck, but I was definitely a wreck after that incident. So I had, adventures. I had wonderful things happen to me as a result of teaching all over the world. So, whether it was horseback rides along the sea in South Africa or on the Sahara Desert, and just, culture, etc. So I had a very rich life, and I just started to pick at what do I think would be really interesting for other people to read, and about the decisions I made along the way. Why did it work? Why was I successful? And what were the good decisions that made me so?
There are so many things in there, so many directions I want to go because I want to address all of this. But you answered one of my questions right off the bat, which is how many countries did storytelling and consulting take you to? Because I loved seeing all of that travel. And maybe we'll just do a really fun little thing now, because I love that story. After the wall fell, how do you hail a cab in Russia?
Yes, you hold up Marlboros. And it was very interesting to be there. And I'm, in some ways, I'm surprised I was so plucky to do that at that time all by myself and not knowing I didn't know where I was going to stay. I didn't know who would pick me up at the airport. Didn't know. I didn't even know how many hours I was to teach a day. I knew I would be there about 10 days. But I was someone who believed in saying yes to adventure if they were safe. And I did check out when I was invited to places. I did check them out. And I turned down Iran, and I turned down Kurdistan. And there were several places and the third time I would have gone to Russia, I turned it down and was advised it was not a good time to go. So I had my resources, which were actually generals and colonels that somebody I know knew, and she would just say, okay, Linda's been invited to Iran. Should she go? And they would advise me, and I always followed their advice. And much of the time, I didn't take for granted they would say yes or no. I just wanted to know what they thought. And so Dubai was fine. I had an invitation to Kurdistan, and they said that would be fine. And then it did get canceled sort of last minute. So there were times I said, I guess that would have been fine. And it was good to have that resource.
Well, that's something I see come up through and through your book. And, just thinking about writers, they reach out to you for help, but you are going off and doing so many things, but you are also mindful that you need to reach out to people for help.
Yes.
And at times I feel like it's very forward thinking. I mean, the travel to have a point person to help know cultural norms and things like that as well. But then also your consultant, Judith, I thought it was so great that you had this. And I really think it was forward thinking to think, okay, I need to bring somebody on my team so I know how to market myself. And she had a lot of great ideas.
Yes, Judith Clare's a career consultant, and she's still in business. And I knew nobody, and I had no money. So the thought of, can I go and hire someone? But Judith and I did a trade. It was early in our career when women were just starting to sort of be entrepreneurs. And she was brilliant because she knew the stages you had to go through to become successful. And we'd go through these stages, and some of them I didn't handle well. And she says, okay, next time this comes up, this is what you do. So one of the stages is that there's a point you start to do well, and you expect we're now home free, and so I'm going to have the same amount of money coming in every month. And she says, don't take that for granted, because you have to normalize and stabilize and keep growing, but you don't want to go backwards. And so she says, one of the tricks is when you start doing well, you reinvest in your business. Do not go and buy the stereo or the new dress. And you're not prosperous yet. So she really guided me. And, what words to use to describe myself. And she says, what's the source of your success? And at the beginning, 85% of my success came as a result of being a member of Women in Film. And women were very helpful. And I didn't realize that. When she says, what's the source? I said, I don't know. And she said, look at the clients of the last 2 months. And I said, oh, I didn't know that. And she said, go to every Women in Film function, because don't just, what a lot of people say is, I'll do this and that. And she said, if it doesn't work, don't keep doing it. So find out what works and then keep doing that.
And one thing here I'll read is she asked you, what language do writers use to describe the difficulties they have? And then she used that word in your advertising. Like today, we would call that search engine optimization or hashtags or all of these ways to make sure the right verbiage is used. But again, this was, what year were we talking?
This was 1983.
Yeah. So again, I think that's very insightful for her. And it also shows that there's a truth that continues.
Yes, because the word that kept coming up that writers needed someone to be objective. And so she says, you start using that word objective in advertising and how you describe yourself.
Yeah. And I love that she also said, if you aren't losing 10% of your business because you're too expensive, you're probably priced too cheaply.
Yes.
And
And she
that's so
also,
insightful. You know, most of everybody watching this, we're all kind of self-starters, entrepreneurs of our own business. And we don't want to say bye, goodbye
yeah,
to possible income, but you have to have a line.
yes. And yeah, she was extremely helpful on just, looking at my clients, understanding where I was, how to make adjustments, how to price my services. I mean, this job didn't exist. And so I got advice. I got advice from several well-known producers that said, I'll do a free script if you help me figure out what to charge. And do I have something here? And they said, yes, what you have is really interesting and special and helpful. So, um, then I would ask other people about that as well. But I think that was one of the secrets of my success. A lot of people say, what is it worth? And I said, that's not the question. What are people willing to pay? And eventually I had many different services. I thought whatever figures in someone's mind when they come to me, there is probably a service, and each service that was more expensive had much more detailing.
And so you touched on, that this is a different era we have to appreciate, because how ubiquitous or lack thereof was the idea of being a screenwriting consultant when you got started.
It didn't exist.
Yeah.
And that was another thing, is what were people doing? Because they had that sense of pride as my baby, and I don't want anyone telling me what to do, but then they would know it didn't work. So most of the time they went to friends who says, I liked it, or, it felt like it dragged a little in the middle. Well, but that didn't solve the problem. You had to know why it dragged. And because I had done a doctoral dissertation on why does a script work? What makes a great script? What are all those elements? And then I flipped that and said, what's missing in this script that if it had it, it would raise its level. So I had a method, a certain approach, and I did free scripts, several free scripts at the beginning, and then I was really cheap at the very beginning. And one person said, I'm not going to pay you $35 for what you've done. I'm going to pay you $100. And I said,
Ah,
oh, yes. And it was worth far more than that. But
sure.
I had to start real small.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot there in that. I tell people, I speak at a lot of high schools, and I'll tell people that if you have a passion for something, even if you don't see it becoming a business, just keep pursuing that passion. Put yourself out there that you are somebody that is an authority on this and that you have a love for this, and make it known that this is your thing. And you'd never know what opportunities might pop up. For
Yeah.
you, it was talking about story at a time when script consulting wasn't a job profession yet, and it took you to 33 countries and decades of work. And that it was because you just kept pursuing something that you found fascinating.
And, the other thing, and it is nice when you start your own business because you can build it around your strengths. So I was diplomatic and I was a self-starter. I didn't have problems getting the work done. I was at my desk at 9 a.m. and took my lunch break. And, I had a very specific schedule, and I was very careful not to interrupt that. I didn't do breakfast meetings. Eventually, I didn't tend to do lunches. Sometimes, I would do a professional lunch, but I tried to make dinner time the business time if necessary, and just guard it, not be interrupted by telephones, know what my process was. And I think that has a lot to do with it too. And then realizing I like to travel, and I like to learn about cultures, so that would happen. And of course, I was working on scripts on all different kinds of subject matters, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot of history. when I'd work on historical. I didn't know about that. So
Yeah.
it was a beautiful career, and it fit my personality, and it fit me. And as it expanded into seminars, I had taught before, and I liked teaching, and figured out how to create a really interesting seminar. And then the book started. My first book came out in '87.
Yeah, and by the way, we were talking about Michael Higg before we started recording, and he another thing he said about you when we were chatting was that you can write a book faster than he can read one.
Yes, yeah. He asked me one time, he says, "Why do you keep writing books?" And I said, "Because I really love to write books." And he said, "Oh," he said, "it's so hard for me to do that." But again, it suited me. I had always wanted to be a writer, and I thought I'd be a fiction writer. But actually, I loved writing nonfiction. And that was, what I've done.
Yeah, and now having a memoir under your belt, you can consult on how to write a memoir.
Yeah.
Well,
The,
if somebody is wanting to sit down and write a memoir, I don't know, what advice would you give them?
I don't really know about writing other memoirs. I only know about writing my own. But
Sure.
I do think to figure out your peak experiences, and the tact I took, and the name of the book is Unpacking, is that each chapter takes an incident or an event or a relationship and then unpacks it. Like, what was important about this? Sometimes, what was the subtext? What was really going on? Why was this a crisis? Or why did this end up in a problematical friendship or relationship? And then how did that get resolved? And what did I learn from it? So every chapter ends with at least a paragraph, sometimes a little longer, called Unpacking, and unpacking the chapter. And one of my friends said, when she saw what I was thinking about, she says, "Well, the title is Unpacking." And of course, that led to the picture of the suitcase. And I have a fabulous cover designer. I just love his covers.
It's almost like the moral of the story or what you've learned along the way. But then there's also some interesting trivia about you sometimes on
Oh,
certain chapters.
oh yeah. At the end of every chapter, there's a little piece of trivia of something, who's your favorite male character, who's Sam Gerard in Fugitive, and my favorite female is Carol in As Good as It Gets. And so every chapter, in some relationship to that chapter, has a little piece of trivia, usually sort of humorous.
It's funny that you bring that one up because I wanted to bring up the Sam Gerard one too, because I've always wanted to make a video essay, and I finally did, where you're kind of doing a deep dive on a movie and why it's working, or something enlightening about it. And I did The Fugitive and really talked a lot about Sam Gerard because he is such a fascinating character. What's your take on him?
Well, he's so dimensional. And Tommy Lee Jones is a great actor. And a lot of people, they do the job of acting. They do their lines and they have the right look and all that. But just like when Richard says to him, "I didn't kill my wife," they're in the tunnels, and he says, "I don't care."
Mm-hmm.
The way he says it, someone said he spent 2 days figuring out how to say that line. And so with a great actor, there's always something going on. But what I liked about the character, is this great sense of humor. At times, he's very team oriented, so it's very collaborative rather than competitive, which I liked. And you can see his growing respect for Richard, and so I liked, that dimension of him. So, and there's an awful lot of we would call the strong men. He was an authority, but he had all these other parts to him, as opposed to all the different detectives we've seen, which you can say they're just all the same. And this one stood out.
It's such just a well-crafted story, so much, because his mission never changes. I think it's two-pronged. It's get Richard Kimball and make sure that justice is served. And Get
Yeah.
Rich or Kimball, that stays constant all the way to the end. But his idea of what justice is kind of changes as he's looking into the story as well.
Yes.
So in a way, he still is just, it's the definition of justice that changes, not the mission. I find that fascinating.
Yes. Yes. It's very good analysis.
So getting back to crafting, unpacking, which again is just such a wonderful book, such a fun book. Before we get too far in, where would you like to send people to go acquire it?
Oh, it's on Amazon. It's real easy. And they can look up my name, Unpacking by Linda Seger, and you'll find it. And it's both the Kindle and it's the paperback.
Yes.
And they can write a review too. I kept the Kindle really cheap. It's just 99 cents because I was hoping everyone who wanted to read it could buy it. And also that would encourage them to write a review.
Excellent idea. I was going to ask you why you said it so affordably. I was happy with that, but I was curious, and I will definitely write a review. I have not yet, but as you know, I really enjoyed it. We should have started where you started, which was Peshtigo, Wisconsin. My wife's dad's family is actually from Peshtigo as well. So, and Molly Cash, who is our COO with the company, she's from Milwaukee. Max Tim, our director of education, he's from Delavan, Wisconsin. I'm recording this right now from Madison, Wisconsin. So there's a lot of Wisconsin in the ISA.
Yes.
So how do you think your town helped craft you to be the woman that you've become?
For one thing, in Peshtigo, there isn't anything like a entitlement, or there's nothing to be snobby about. There's only 2,500 of us. And so in a sense, sometimes they call them Midwestern values. You just, there's not a lot of ego going on, and you try to live your life in a good way. And I had a marvelous mother who was very visionary, and she didn't mind us, finding our wings and going out in the world. And I think it also made me want to do adventures because, as I said, nothing ever happens in Peshtigo, except for one of the worst forest fires in the history of the world, which was the same day as the Chicago fire, 1871. I wasn't around. And then the Great Peshtigo Bank robbery, which was when I was 10 years old. And so part of the fun of that first chapter is nothing ever happens except for, and establishing me as someone who wanted adventure and started to step out into the world, but kept those kind of small town values. So when people in LA were all about money and power and what you drive is, it's like I just thought that was sort of silly. On the other hand, I did get a red sports car at one. I loved red, and I had the cutest. It was a Toyota MR2, and I realized people's opinion really went up because I had a red sports car. And I thought, if this is how the game is played, if I had lunch with someone, I made sure to get my car first from the valet so that they would see what I was driving, because I would do that with sort of a sense of humor. But I knew that was important. And one day an executive called me the next day and she said, I was so surprised about what you were driving. And I said, what did you think I was going to drive? And she said, a gray Honda. I said, well, that was my last car. But anyway, I thought it's really true. That's the big thing, is who do you know and what do you drive?
That's wild.
So that's Hollywood.
Right. And then how much did you live in Los Angeles proper?
25 years in Venice. It wasn't 25 years in Venice. I was in Culver City. I was in Los Feliz for a while. I was in Venice for, in 1988, we got a house in Venice and then moved in 2002 to Colorado. So I was sort of in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And you're always in the car and you don't know what traffic is like.
Is it about 40 years that you've been a consultant, or what's the?
I started in 81 and I retired in 2020. So it was 39 years.
Okay.
And technically I was 41 years in the business, because I did I was a reader for a little over a year, a story analyst, and I did some work for a production company. So I sort of entered in 1979 and 1980, and then started my business in 81.
Gotcha. So, I mean, a pretty significant amount of the time you're not in Los Angeles, but still continuing to work. Is that, I mean, I guess you're traveling a lot as well.
Well, yes. So we moved to Colorado, which was my dream since I was 13 years old. And we moved in 2002. I happened to see my dream house when I was out here right before 9/11 on September 10th. And I said, if we don't move now, I mean, it's 100-year-old log, 2-story log home. So, and I really had to be concerned. Could I continue my business? But my business was pretty international. And I thought, what do they care where they send the script?
Right.
And there was an airport in Colorado Springs, so I could fly any place. I could write my books here. And by that time, there was another funny thing that happened in the film industry. If you got out of LA, it meant you were successful because you could get out of LA. And so it worked in my favor to be out of LA. She must be doing really well because she can continue her business from any place. So we've really loved being here. And then I thought a lot about when to retire. So I retired in 2020 and felt good. I spent 2 years thinking about that. And it's been interesting because I absolutely adored my career. And and then it was time. I mean, I'm older. I'm among the older people. So I will be 80 years old in August.
Wow.
And I retired when I think I was 75.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I bring it up because a lot of people, a lot of our writers, they're people that are not in Los Angeles and they're wondering, is it mandatory? And, I lived in Los Angeles for 8 years and, I enjoyed my time out there, but I love it out here as well. But like you said, there's an airport nearby. If I need to go back, I go back.
Yeah.
And not being there all the time, it really makes me make the most of the time when I am in town.
Yes.
It's very easy. One day just blends into the next, but hey, I'm in town for a week. So let's make all these meetings happen during that week. And I don't know, it just seems more efficient.
Yes. And I do think, it's helpful to spend some time there because, like I said, one of my secrets to my success was being a member of Women in Film and being ubiquitous in their meetings. And so a lot of things are meeting people and also knowing how to handle the people you meet. Because what happens is so many people look at others and say, what can you do for, they're not saying it outright, but it's, what can you do for me? How important are you? And early in my years, the joke used to be, you go to a reception or a function and you see someone who's more important than you, but they know you, and say they do air kisses on both sides of your cheek. They look over your shoulder to see who is more important than you. And then they say, oh, must run and go talk to Judy. And then there's a point when people actually come up to you and decide you're important enough to talk to. And I started thinking about that. So many people are takers. And Judith Clare said, learn to be a giver. And you think about, well, what do I have to give? Like when I met Ron Howard, what do I have to give Ron Howard? Well, he endorsed one of my books, and we happened to have a gourmet popcorn store in my little town of Cascade, which is population about 600. And I sent him a huge tin. It had a mountain scene on it, 3 different kinds of popcorn inside, and sent him popcorn from the gourmet popcorn store. And his secretary said, well, it went really fast. But you think about this and just say, I don't think anyone else sent him gourmet popcorn. He could go buy it, but he doesn't have a store near him like I do. So, and you think sometimes that there really are people I don't know, something comes up and you might know something about that subject that they don't, even though they are, quote, more important than you. And so, and I also had to learn, especially when I was doing interviews for some of my books, like one of my books is The Collaborative Art of Filmmaking. And I interviewed 70 of, the best directors and composers and actors, etc. And what I hadn't realized at first is people enjoyed the interviews. And so I was always conscious of time, like, well, maybe, I realize I don't want to go over their time. And I did learn to say, do you want to take another 10 minutes? And almost everyone said yes.
Mm.
And I said, why do I take for granted that they don't enjoy talking to me?
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we get in this, we rank the other people so clearly on who's more important and would they ever talk to little old me? Yeah. And you say, yeah, they're actually enjoying talking to you and you're asking good questions and other people have not asked them those questions.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely very possible, very common, probably for all of us at a certain level to see people at a different level and kind of not even think of them as human anymore.
Yeah,
We
yes.
mythologize them so much.
Yeah, the great gods. And
Right.
and what was interesting, I interviewed Ron Howard twice, and the first time we had lunch in his office, and I asked for 10 to 20 minutes. He says, would you like 2 hours? I said, yes. And then I interviewed him both times for Collaborative Art of Filmmaking. But when people found out I knew Ron Howard, they presumed I was a close personal friend and could call him and tell him about their script. And I was very connected with his secretary. So if I wanted an endorsement or if I wanted to say, loved Ron's last film, I would write to her. And she always wrote back right away. And the one time I mentioned a script I'd worked on that he might be interested in, and the response from her was cool. And I caught it immediately. And I said, this is not my relationship with Ron. Sure. Is that he obviously respected my work a lot. He liked me, but I said, I am not supposed to suggest scripts. And people don't always understand that probably the reason he did the interviews because I wasn't going to do that to him. Right. And because he loved my questions and my openness and things like that. So there is a lot of using people in the business, and one of them to try to learn not to do that.
Yeah, and a lot of people certainly have their guard up for that exact reason. It happens so frequently.
Yes.
Yeah, and you want to stay on the correct side of that. That perception. Getting into one of your projects that you worked on, I found it so fascinating that I found your approach so fascinating when you were asked to consult and work on some problems with MacGyver, the TV series. It had been on for a few seasons at that point, but they were running out of steam. So I love that you asked for them to send copies of what they consider their best episode and their worst episode, and what the network separately considered their best, and the Bible of the entire series. This is just a really good approach for anybody that's wanting to write a spec, also to just try to absorb as much as possible. Yes. But so if you can talk about that experience, and then also what some of the writers were telling you that maybe wasn't widely known about some of the other issues.
What was so interesting about it was they weren't having a problem. They had been on 4 seasons, and they said, we just are running out of ideas on what to do. And so and they loved my book, Making a Good Script Great. So their idea was have Linda come in and let's go back to basics and let's have a seminar in screenwriting. But I thought that's not really what the problem is. It's not about basics. So I said, write me, emails. And some of them felt their female characters were not strong enough. So I addressed that, and one of the producers got defensive about like what's wrong with them. And I've learned to stay calm in crises. And I said, well, several writers mentioned that the women maybe could be stronger. And I said, I have some ideas. Would you like to hear them? And it's a great thing, even in consulting, if a writer gets defensive, I said, I have some ideas on how to make this maybe work a little bit better, be stronger. Would you like to hear them? And we know what the answer is. So the producer toned it down. But what was funny was during that moment, all the writers were looking down at their pages like, I don't want to see what's going on right now. And how is Linda going to handle it? But another thing is they just said, it's not like a detective series where he is given an assignment every week. He kind of falls into the story. So I said, let's think of a variety of ways he could fall into the story where each concept could give you 5 storylines. So like he's on vacation. Okay. You can do a lot of falling into stories on vacation, or he's he's at a social event, weddings, funerals, and we would take newsprint and write all over is, okay, here's the concept. What kind of storylines might you get from that? So we had we had newsprint all over, taped to the walls. And what was interesting was they were on for 7 years. So after that, when they thought they had run out of steam, they had 3 more years of ideas, and it kept its popularity,
Right.
quite well. But it was a wonderful experience for me, and it was, something I could not have made happen. Is I think that one of the producers admired my book, and the students, the writers did, and so they sought me out. But it was great.
Yeah. And did you follow the following season and see how much
Yeah.
of your input came onto the screen?
Yeah, and I saw the women get stronger and have more to offer, the story. And I got to ride in my first limousine when they picked me up at the airport. And then one of the women said, do you want the limousine to take you back, or I could drive you? And I said, oh, the limousine will be fine.
Yeah.
And I was sitting in the back trying to, bite my cheek so I did laugh at being in the limousine. And I've been in a few since, but that was my first experience, and it was great fun.
Nice. Also, I love that you have these 2 chapters back to back, chapters 10 and 11. Famous people I met or was in the room with, followed by famous people who said bad things about me.
Yes.
So because there's such a trepidation at times, like, oh, I don't want to sound like a name dropper, but if a story's interesting and noteworthy, it's still interesting and noteworthy and worth talking about. So how did you approach telling those stories?
I sort of tried to think about some of it. I tried to think about was my emotional reaction to certain characters. When I was in the same room with Tom Selleck, it's like, oh my gosh, I mean, nobody is that gorgeous. And I think one of the fun things was when I met the writer of on Golden Pond. His name is Ernest Thompson, and he was gorgeous. We were both at Boston College doing speeches in 2 different rooms, and the person who hosted me, we were all in the green room before we left. And he had the bomber jacket, and he had the beautiful shoes, and he had the white silk scarf, and just ruggedly handsome. You know how all those movies talk about, all the scripts say they're ruggedly handsome. This guy truly was. So when we walked to our different rooms together, I was absolutely mute. I didn't say a word. I could not, I was frozen. And my host, Laura, who was 5 months pregnant, she was chattering away. And we he went one direction, and we looked at each other, and there was a bench, and we sunk into it. And I said, Laura, how could you talk in the midst of that gorgeousness? And she said, Linda, I didn't know what to do. He was so gorgeous. So I started chattering, and me, who is always has something to say, it was probably one of the only times I was absolutely mute. And then I found out one of my friends in Colorado lives a mile down the road, used to date him. And I said, oh,
Huh.
that's not possible. I mean, how could you even be on a date with him? You'd blubber with your food if you're out to dinner. So, so some of them, and some like, what do you say when you meet Raquel Welch? And I was surprised at a reception. I met her, and it's like, I grasped for something, and I said, how do you stay beautiful all these years? And I could tell that was the right thing to say.
Yeah.
Because when she talked later at the Television Academy, she mentioned that someone had asked her that question. I said, oh, my angel must have been with me on, what to say.
Right.
So it was sort of fun to think. One of my friends early in my career said, because sometimes people would say negative things about me who didn't know me, like, how could she be a script consultant? She hasn't won an Academy Award or hasn't written a script. And my friend Kathleen said to me, if you're going to be a public figure, people will have opinions on you, even though they know nothing about you. Mm-hmm. And you have to decide if that's okay. And she says, you only can do the best you can and being kind to people and doing the best work you can as a consultant in seminar. And then when somebody says that, is just don't get too nervous about it. And one of the women that I knew, a friend, one day she said to me, Linda, are you a bit of a star? And I said, well, in my field, I am. And she says, well, I was talking to someone who's writing a script, and I mentioned you, and they got so excited that I knew you. They started asking all these personal questions. And I said, what did you say? And she said, I said, Linda is very nice. And I said, that is the correct response, because people, as they say, get the skinny on you. They want to know who you're feuding with, if you got any problems with anyone. And sometimes people set you up. They'll say, well, what do you think of Bob McKee or Michael Hay? Mm-hmm. And one of my policies was to never talk badly about a colleague. And I did it once, which you saw in the book Unpacking. I talked badly about something I'd seen on the screen, a guy who did the titles for Age of Innocence. I didn't like him. I said something in the seminar in Copenhagen, and that night I'm in the lobby waiting to go out to dinner, and I see a woman that was in the class, and she said, I said, are you waiting to go out to dinner with me in the group? And she said, no, I'm meeting Saul Bass. He's the guy that did the titles. He was staying in the same hotel as me. He was coming down the elevator, and this woman said, would you like to meet him? And I thought, I hope you're nicer than me. Yeah. That'll teach me that even in Copenhagen. And so I met him, and I said, so nice to meet you. I'm familiar with your work. And I thought, boy, oh boy, don't ever do that again. So I always had, I had two friends where I could discreetly tell them, like, I'm disgusted with what a colleague did or with what happened. And I said, don't tell anyone, because that's not for public consumption. And, but I could at least be authentic, because there were times I was disgusted or angry. And they also were very wise. I said, should I say something or not? And sometimes they said, yes, you're in the best position to make a statement about what this person is doing because it's unethical. And I think someone needs to say something, and you can do it, and probably people will listen. And other times, as my friends would say, don't get none of that on you. Leave
Yeah.
it alone and just it's not your problem, and don't get involved with that. You have one
Sure. Yeah.
lose, win. But there were times where I think when you become known and people respect you, that you really have a responsibility at times to speak out, and
Yeah.
where something, and I tried to always do it diplomatically, and I usually confronted some of my colleagues, and sometimes we'd write these emails or letters together, and sometimes we'd say, no, I shouldn't be the one, it's this other person who should be the one to say something. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of why. I think one of the things in the memoir, there were a lot of wise decisions I made, and I was surprised how many decisions one has to make when you're in business and when you get to sort of be on the world stage. And how are you going to handle that? And at what point do you think you're the best in the world? And your head has gotten really big and say, it's time for me to do something,
Yeah.
to do something about this, as I'm beginning to believe my press, and you don't need to do that. And
Yeah.
so there's things in the memoir about how I balanced my life. I went back to horseback riding and did a cattle drive and did things. And when you're moving cattle, they really don't care how many books you've written or who can you get the cow out of the thicket? And
Right.
so I deliberately became a beginner. I mean, I had written before, but not for years. But I put myself in an uncomfortable place, and I loved horses, and where I wasn't the best. If there were a group of us riding, I was one of the worst riders. I got better, and I did competitive horseback riding, and by the end, sometimes people would say, you're my role model. I said, that's so cool. So, because I kept the branches from knocking my head off. Yeah, I knew how to duck.
Right.
So,
Well, getting to the book and unpacking, were there moments of revelation kind of in telling the stories and revisiting, going back in time in your head, and did you discover more about your own life by looking back at it anew?
yeah, and um, I think it helped to question things that maybe I hadn't questioned before or was trying to figure out, and to sort of look at the layers of things. And I always have readers. I usually have 5 to 8 readers who give me feedback, and I say, is this funny? Is this interesting? Did I lose you? Are you confused? And so things would bubble up to the top. When I started writing, there were some things I knew I wanted to write about. But then as I was writing, one of the themes that began to come out was small town girl longs for adventure and ends up going around the world. And so then you start picking up that theme and realizing, well, I should talk about this incident.
Mm.
And I also wanted to be honest. There, one of the chapters is called Crisis in Bulgaria, and I team taught with a colleague, and it just about broke up our friendship and our colleagueship, and we had to get it back, and it took a couple years of saying we're not comfortable being in this place. So the name has changed. In fact, a lot of chapters, the names are changed. Judith Clare's name has not changed, my career consultant. But so I wanted to examine what in the world was going on that created this huge crisis when you're simply team teaching a seminar. And I wanted to, not only examine that, but to recognize we both had integrity. And we were somehow both determined there had to be a way to reconnect. And I admired, as I was going through this, I thought, I admire both of us for the way that we handled this situation. And so I wanted to examine what can happen between colleagues, as I was doing more team teaching, and I had wonderful colleagues, and I was very much in touch with them. And in the late 80s, we started to try to not be competitive. As we said, let's not do the competitive model. And sometimes people would say, well, I took a seminar from your competitor. And I'd say, I don't have competitors, I have colleagues.
Yeah.
And it took me quite a while in the 1980s to get over this competition bit. But I worked really hard. And I worked with a therapist on it too. But, and thankfully I had some wonderful colleagues who also were willing to be colleagues. You mentioned Michael Haig, who's just a dear man and a very, very kind person and very successful person. And so, we said, no, let's do that. Let's do our jobs without a pit in our stomach. Yeah. And I said, I don't want my career to be filled with, irritations. And so once I got over that irritation, things not only were smooth, but they were happy. It was a very happy career. And the seminars went well. There's another, I had one conflict with somebody in one of my seminars, one of my hosts, and I was just totally disgusted with how I dealt with stuff. And as I was ready to leave, as he said, but I never let you down. I said, you let me down every day I was here. and supposedly, somebody says we've been in touch with him and he always apologizes for how he treats you. And so I did learn, I didn't stand up enough for myself in that trip. I did stand up somewhat, and I learned something, and I wish I had stood up more. But I did learn, generally I was incredibly gracious and things went smooth and my hosts were gracious. But yeah. My mother would say, he's a pill. He used to say that, or a jerk. But but that was very rare. Thinking 33 countries, and some of those I went several times. So it wasn't 33 trips. It could have been 50 or 60 trips, because I was in Germany 4 times, and Britain at least 4 times. And so I had, just wonderful people I worked with.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of them, the name comes up a lot, is Pamela J. Smith.
Oh, yes.
You could tell in the book that she means a lot to you and gave you some great advice through the years. I'll wrap it up on this, but I will say that anybody watching this, please leave any comments or questions, and we might do a follow-up video. So please do leave if there's any questions that we didn't get to. And I'm telling you, I wanted to talk about Angkor Wat in Cambodia. We didn't get to that.
Oh, yes.
As I said, Pamela J. Smith. Oh, and Loretta Young. There's so many great stories, many great stories in this book. But towards the end of the book, and for a large portion of the end of the book, you do talk a lot about spirituality.
Yes.
And, your faith. And I just wanted to maybe end on this, like, what for you does spirituality or philosophy, how does that impact how you approach storytelling?
Well, it really impacts my creativity. I wrote a book called God's Part in Our Art about the relationship of spirituality and creativity. So I generally don't have writer's block. That doesn't mean I'm not sometimes without an idea, but I set And I was a Quaker for 50 years, and we sit in silence, and I sit in silence, and I say I have to go deeper, and I need to get more emotionally in touch with this material to dig into it and not just say the obvious. And so I think that sense that to me, the Holy Spirit is part of the creative spirit. And I won't say 100% they're the same, but I do think they're connected. And I think for spiritual people, they're very connected.
Mhm.
So, and it's kept me sane is, and tried to keep my values clear of being in an industry that can pull you in different directions, the whole money and power and who do you know and what do you drive bit. And
Yeah.
so, I think that that's very important. It kind of keeps your head on your shoulders in a good way. Plus, from a spiritual viewpoint, I felt called to script consulting, and that kept me going when there were lots of struggles and obstacles. It says somehow I'm being pulled into this, and I interpret that as a calling or a mission. People can think of it in a lot of different ways. So, and I think also I was surrounded by good people. I tried not to get involved with the toxic people, even if they were really famous and maybe could do something for me. It's like, no, that's not what I want my life to be. And there are a lot of scoundrels in the business, and I worked with some of them and had to find a way to deal with them, and how fast can I get this script done and not have to ever see that person again. So
It's unfortunately true, but there are just also just so many wonderful people. And as you mentioned, well, first off, you are one of them. And also, as you mentioned, this writing a memoir is just such a great opportunity to highlight those wonderful people that are in the industry or in your life. And it's a gift to give back. So,
yes, that is
well,
true.
thank you so much for your time. And like I said before, if you have any other topics for Linda to speak on, please leave a comment. Also, in the meantime, check out her book. Head over to Amazon and look it up. It is called Unpacking.